One of the greatest and most sustained pro-Jesus and anti-Paul passage of any book is in the book of Bouck White, Call of the Carpenter. I found this many years ago, and I love this, and I kind of forget about it sometimes, and I want to share it with all of you. So I'm going to try to read it without too much comment, so we can get through it in a reasonable time. But you'll see, I just want to give you a look here. He's going to have the Gospels corrected Paul's misunderstandings as topic one. And that's based on the fact that the Gospels came after him. We'll see uh, his argument on that. Then we're going to see Paul's background in Roman imperialism. And so he was encouraging that. Paul was encouraging that. The 12 apostles reject Paul initially, and we'll go into that. The final conversion of Paul was to a different Jesus. Yes, that's very much true. Paul's vision of a unified church in the model of an empire. Yes, we'll see what he means by that. Paul's goal was a betrayal of the master's purposes. We'll see about that. Paul boasts he learned nothing from the 12. That's absolutely a fact. That's in Galatians. Paul eschews influence from the 12. Absolutely. He says he learned nothing from them. He didn't want to know anything from them. Paul's disdain for the poor. This shows you who his character, his disjunction from Jesus, who was totally the opposite. Paul's tactical ambiguity, basically talking out of both sides of his mouth. Next, we have Christianity betrayed from within. So this was a betrayer of Christ within our own ranks. How Paul's writings were added to the New Testament. And then Jesus' message was one of equal rights and no dominion over each other. Yes, he said he was our sole teacher, but otherwise we were completely equal one with another. And there's to be no dominion amongst us. Modern brand of Christianity has become immoral. We'll see what he means by that. I haven't read this in years, so I don't remember that anymore. Uniqueness of Jesus, why we must follow him. Judaism is rising back up to embrace an original Christianity. So if we could get back to Jesus, we would be more in a line with Jews who, in the end of time, according to the book of Revelation, are supposed to be unified with us. So I see what's coming is that with this new information, basically Christians can now access the information about Paul, which was inaccessible to us prior to the last 100 years. We're going to eventually become closer to Jesus, which will be closer to original Jewish Christianity of his era that was not corrupted. Remember, it had the Sadducees and Pharisees. So we're not fans of the Pharisees of today or the Orthodox positions of today. We can get along with them, but we need to bring them along to the position of Christ. All right, let's see what else we have here. Status quo thinking is what crucified Christ. And then I make a small comment, and that's it. So hopefully I can do this within, I think, 20 to 30 minutes. So, but there's a lot of juice there and a lot of fun stuff. So hang in there. I'll try to get through it all. And I'm trying to let you hear a perspective from this gentleman. In 1911, the book was about Bouck White, The Call of the Carpenter. Okay, so let's begin. Here's my introduction. This is a book that extols Jesus over Paul. It went through an early edition. I found online the edition from 1911, Bouck White, The Call of the Carpenter, Doubleday, 1911. And if you go to this web article, it's called Review of Bouck White, Call of the Carpenter, you will find the link. And you can also just go to books.google.com and just type any of these titles in and they'll pop up. The author sees Jesus as a rebel against the religious hypocrisy and self-seeking and greed of the day. Quote, Jesus was foe of religion insofar as interfered with active service, just as much as he was a foe of selfishness and greed. That's page 96. Here are sections about Paul. Let's listen in. The Gospels corrected Paul's misunderstandings. Page 163. Paul was sincere according to his lights. He spun theory of Jesus and of Christianity largely out of his own brain and regarded it as heaven sent. We, however, have an advantage that Paul lacked. The gospel narratives were not written until after his time, or at least not until after the biggest part of his literary output had been completed and his doctrinal ideas had formed and become set. We therefore have documentary evidence as to the carpenter, where Paul had only hearsay, and the documentary evidence disproves in toto the theory that Jesus was rejected by his nation. The glad acclaim with which the common people greeted him and saw in him their deliverer protrudes from every page of the record. The fires of the conflagration that were to break out in revolution a few years later were already kindled in the hearts of the multitude. The gospel narrative heaves and tosses on thin crust, separating the volcanic heats underneath, takes away those interior fires. The story take away those interior fires. The story is unintelligible, not Excuse me, everyone. Take away those interior fires, the story is unintelligible. Maybe there's a little unintelligibility there. Not public utterance of the carpenter, but had reference, direct or indirect, to the insurgency that it was a boil in the hearts of the people. He was never at pains to seek popularity, it was thrust upon him. His effort to curb that popularity rather than to incite it. Until he appeared, people were sheep as not having a shepherd. Now they have obtained the shepherd. They rally to him with an embarrassing wealth of loyalty. Page 164. That Jews refuse to receive Jesus is one of the crudest libels ever visited on people. References to the enthusiasm which they lavished upon him are frequent. We read that they thronged to him. All the cities were gathered together at the door. They came from every quarter. He could not so much as eat bread. The people were all hung upon him, listening. They said unto him, all men seek for thee. As a background to the story throughout, stand the multitudes. Erase them. The narrative is meaningless. That's a very good point. We just let these dispensationalists just dismiss Jesus as rejected without looking at what the people's true reaction was. Sure, the leadership did. The religious leaders, like even today, they reject Jesus. They don't follow him. They're just trying to make coin that Paul authorizes. And so we, the people, must throng to Jesus, and that they repress that. We do not hear the words of Jesus when we go to church. Anyway, I digress. I got involved, and let's hear what he has to say. Let's keep listening. But it's great, isn't it? And this popularity followed him in Jerusalem during his last week. This last week, it was to prove his death week. In order to draw attention to his message, he had made his entry into Jerusalem dramatic by means of stately procession, and a very great multitude spread their garments in the way. Others cut down branches from the trees and strewed them in the way. We read, all the people were attentive to hear him. His cleansing of the temple, driving out thence the federated and officially entrenched thieves who had been long preying on the people, was immediately popular, an immediately popular act. Quote, then assembled together the chief priests and scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people. Again, quote, early in the morning he came into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. Again, quote, if we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. End of quote. The fact that there was crowd of court, the carpenter now was safe for so long as he was in the presence of the people. His bearing at this time evidences his perfect assurance of safety, provided they, the people, were around. For we read that, quote, he taught daily in the temple. He was at home in the restaurants and wine shops of Jerusalem, and by his winsome camaraderie made friends among the common people everywhere. The Philippic, I guess that means a speech, he delivered at this time against the Jerusalem oligarchy would not have been possible in one who had not had the backing of the populace. For that invective is in the words which sting like whiplashes. As this didn't copyright. As piece of I guess it says, as a piece of concentrated verbal damnation, it stands probably without peer. Yes, he condemned the leadership terribly. I mean, in a good way, upbraiding them for their unrighteousness, their hypocrisy. The hot metaphors race upon the heels one of another, surging out of an oceanic wrath and speeded by poet's command of epithet. Woe unto you, you devour widows' houses, ye shall receive the greater damnation. Child of hell, you blind guides, you fools and blind hypocrites, you strain at the net and swallow the camel, full of extortion, excess, whited sepulchres full of dead men's bones, serpents, generation of vipers, how can you escape damnation of hell? By the way, we crossed to page 166 just a few words earlier. Let's continue here. Of similar strain was the parable of the vineyard keepers, those rulers of Israel who forgot that their position at the head of the nation was stewardship, trust to be used for the people, and who exploited that trust for their own enrichment. Quote, and the chief priests and the scribes sought to lay hold on him, but feared the people, for they knew that he had spoken the parable against them. So basically, Mr. White is making a great case that the people were on Jesus' side. The Jews had totally turned over to him, but it was only the leadership, that elite. They did not want to respect Jesus, just like today, ladies and gentlemen, just like it's been for almost since the era of Constantine to this day. The elite, are paid off and bought off by it started with the government buying them off. Now they got us to be cajoled into paying them money to teach us, and we're allowing them to use our money against us to repress Jesus. Although we think they're bringing us Jesus, they're not. Go listen to the sermons. They're always, every time, 13-1 quotes of Paul to Jesus every time. Check it out. Every denomination I went to, no matter what denomination it was, it doesn't matter. It's 13-1 Paul over Jesus in quotations. But I digress. So let's keep. I'm going to pause here and we'll come right back. Okay, so the next topic in Bouck White's book is Paul's background in Roman imperialism, page 227. So just so you know, he jumps around and brings up Paul at various points in his book, but most of the time he's doing a biography of Jesus. The annexing process was started by a Roman citizen named Saul. Formerly Jew, he deserted his nationality and with it his former name and called himself thereafter Paul. Paul was undeniably sincere. And now I take that position as well, but many people say he was insincere. Either way, he's illegitimate, so it doesn't matter. I believe he felt he actually saw something on the road to Damascus. It just couldn't be Jesus. That's my view. So I agree with Bouck White, but those people who disagree, I have no problem really with that either, because we can see he's dishonest with the Sanhedrin when he's charged in the Acts 21-22 passages. It definitely is lying to the high priest. He doesn't even know who the high priest was. I didn't know who's the high priest ordered me to be slapped when the high priest has to wear this image on his head, which says he's the blessed of the Lord or something to those words to those effect. And Paul claimed he had worked for the Pharisees, so you would have to know who the high priest. He said he worked for the high priest before, so wouldn't he have seen the guy with this thing on his head? He can't go out of the house without wearing it. It's commanded in the law of God, so it just doesn't make sense. He's just totally fibbing there. So he's not a truthful person later, but I believe he was sincere in what he said. So let's keep going and listen to how Bouck White puts this. He believed that in reinterpreting the Christian faith so as to make it acceptable to the Romans, he was doing that faith, Christianity, a service. His makeup was imperial rather than democratic. Both by birth and training, he was unfitted to enter into the working class consciousness of Galileans. He was in culture Hellenist, in religion Pharisee, in citizenship Roman. From the first strain, Hellenism, he received bias in the direction of philosophy rather than economics. From the second, his Pharisaism, he received bias toward aloofness, otherworldliness, and from the third, his Romanism. He received bias toward political acquiescence and the preservation of the status quo. The intensity with which he first along persecuted the Jesus cult was evidence of this mental makeup. In those Galileans, Paul saw contempt of the learned and culture class, and thereupon the Hellenist in him flamed up. He saw in them disregard of churchly morals, and the Pharisee in him flamed up. He saw in them further revolutionary spirit, and the Roman citizen in him flamed up. So that during this period he had been very zealous in his opposition to the way. Then he, page 228, he experienced conversion. Okay, now I don't agree he converted to anything but a false Jesus on the road to Damascus, but regardless. But his conversion did not change these mental forms into which he had been cast and in which his nature had been hardening through 5 and 20 years. So what he's saying is, yeah, okay, so he, quote, converted, but he then was doctrinally set already prior to even encountering this figure Jesus on the road to Damascus. So he's got 25 years of hardened experience. Rather, he carried his mental furniture over into the new allegiance. When he became Christian, it was Hellenistic, Pharisaic, and essentially Romanized type of Christian, and very different from the Galilee brand. So let's stop there and we'll go to the next. Okay, next topic is the 12 apostles reject Paul initially, page 228. And the proof of this is that the Galilean company, after they found out the real spirit that was in this, quote, convert, refused to recognize him. On the contrary, they quarreled with him bitterly. The fight is narrated in the Acts of the Apostles. References it to what are also found in Paul's writings and his complaints as to the way the original Galilean band are treating him. Scholars, finding natural affinity with the Pauline type of mind, take Paul's side and explain the controversy as one in which Paul stood for Christianity's release from ceremonial law of Judaism. But the Galileans were notorious for their disregard and irreverence of Jewish ceremonials. And in the narrative, the quarrel in the Acts, Peter and his followers waived this point. That's a good point. No, the opposition between the two parties was deep lying. It was more the difference of view as to the importance or non-importance of Jewish. It was more than difference of view as to the importance or non-importance of Jewish ceremonial laws. It was an opposition of spirit. It was the fundamental antinomy, Jewish democratism in Peter and his fellow Galileans, as opposed to the Roman imperialism in Paul. So he's basically saying you can see doctrinally Paul is lining up to make a Romanized Christianity, while the Galileans wanted to make a Jewish democratic where the people are all equal and they serve the Lord Jesus and Yahweh above him. And so that makes it a democratic institution under someone who's holy and just like Jesus and of course, ultimately Yahweh. Next is the next heading. The next heading is entitled The Final Conversion of Paul Was to a Different Jesus, page 229. Finally, on the Damascus road, the Roman, meaning Paul, achieved the victory. To be jarred loose from his ancestral holdings dazed him for time. No intense nature ever yet expatriated him itself without experiencing a wrench. When he recovered, the Jew in him was dead. The Saul had become Paul. True, Jesus was a factor in this conversion experience, but the Jesus to whom Paul went over was not the carpenter of Galilee, but rather an imperial magnate, lord of renewed and glorified Roman Empire. Christianity did not change Paul so much as Paul changed Christianity. Paul planned to make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. It needed religion badly. The catalog of its vices in the forepart of the Epistle of the Romans is proof. Paul, the Roman citizen, saw nothing but excellence in Rome's worldwide empire. And that's true. If you look at Romans 13, I think it's 1 to 4. I mean, he's saying everything the government, and basically the only government that is involved in Judea at that time is the Roman Empire. And he's saying, whatever they say, you must obey for conscience sake, for basically they speak for God. They're authorized agents of God. And the irony is that when it came to the Ten Commandments, Paul in Galatians 3:19 says it came from the angels, not God Yahweh at Sinai. And so all the Ten Commandments came through a mediator from angels, and that's all. And then he says, why do you want us to Sabbath? He says, then why do you want to obey those who are no God? So he puts down obeying the law as to because it was given by angels. But when it comes to the Roman Empire in Romans 13, 1 to 4, he says you must obey it for conscience sake because they speak for God. So it's like the Roman authority is a higher authority than even angels of God. That's unbelievable. But anyway, I digress. So let's get back to what he's saying. But he's totally right. Next, only it must be redeemed from its laxity of morals, meaning Rome. Therefore, he would bring to the Christ as its cleanser and thereby its perpetuator. It was the test of loyal citizenship among Romans to seek out in every part of the world that which was most rare and valued and bring it to Rome as a gift. Thus, her sons went forth and returned laden with richest trophies to lay at her feet, meaning Rome's feet. They brought her pearls from India, gold chariots from Babylon, elephants from interior Africa, high-breasted virgins from the Greek Isles, Phidian marbles from Athens. Paul also be a bringer of gifts to the Rome that had honored him and his fathers with the high honor of citizenship. And the gift he would bring and lay at their feet would be the richest of them all, religion. All right, so that ends that section. Okay, the next section is Paul's vision of a unified church in the model of empire. Accordingly, Paul set to cast Christianity into, page 230, the mold of the Roman Empire. In his tours, we find him traveling the main trodden routes of the Roman legions and merchants. His geography is the geography of the empire. The various metropoli, the administration headquarters of the several provinces, become his headquarters also. He plans an imperial church patterned after the empire, and that there shall be reign in it an iron uniformity. National qualities will be abolished, and all things brought under the centralized and powerful head. Himself of an imperial temperament, so that he ill-brooked any spirit of independency on the part of subordinates, notes his refusal to forgive John Mark and his split with Barnabas. Paul found the Roman masterful type congenial and sought to incorporate it into the Christian system. So in other words, he's saying, look how he can't get along with John Mark or Barnabas, and he has to separate from these people because he can't get his way with them. So he's going to push them out. And And so that John Mark, by the way, is everybody says is presumably the author of the Gospel of Mark, and he can't even get along with him. And then Barnabas, who has ideologically very similar ideas to Paul, and he wrote the epistle to the Hebrews, according to Tertullian in the 200s. Tertullian, speaking in the 200s, said that is the person who authored the epistle of Hebrews. Paul can't even get along with somebody who thinks just like he does. So it's like, wow, just the guy had to dominate everything he was involved in. And this is a very interesting point that Mr. Bouck White makes. Okay, continuing. He, Paul, shares with other Christians the idea that the catastrophic end of the age is approaching. But the new order of society, which he thinks of as following the cataclysm, is the Roman Empire still. Only Jesus will now be its imperator. Christ, the emperor, will have put all enemies under his feet. The new empire will be despotism as iron-handed as the present one. Only it will be benevolent despotism. Okay, now we'll go to the next section, and we'll just take. Okay, so the next section is Paul eschews influence from the 12, page 232. Paul has nothing to do with Mary the mother. He never mentions her name. His quarrel with the Galilean, page 233, company implies quarrel with her also, for she was passionately at one with them. I don't know where he gets that from, but anyway. Had he been humble enough to sit for a while at the feet of Mary and her fellow Galileans, he would never have made the mistake of attributing imperialistic designs to a leader, I think he meant to say, who enjoined, call no man master, and whose forehead he refused to wear kingly crown, though the people urgently proffered it to him. But Paul had been too long a Pharisee of Pharisees, and it was not characteristic of the Pharisee type, with its pride of class and pride of culture, to take instruction from illiterate Galileans. Quote, thou wast altogether born in sin, and does thou teach us? And they cast him out. Paul's much learning had bred in him distrust of ignorant people, as he calls them, meaning thereby people who had not college education. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them. Okay, so he's quoting Paul, and he's saying, see how he keeps calling people ignorant, as if he's so superior and more knowledgeable than they are. Typically, and then he says, this is a kind of expression you would hear typically from the Pharisees, meaning, of superiority instead of humbleness. And then he goes on, and one inconceivable in the mouth of the carpenter, who, when he saw the multitude, was moved with compassion on them, quote, who commended their unaffected natures, who cherished clasp from their callous hands more than from the hands of the haughty scholar class, and who called them with infinite tenderness, babes and little ones, rejoicing that his way, which was hid from the wise and prudent, was revealed unto babes. So he's making a very important point, is that Christianity was not designed to be from the people who were the higher classes. It was supposed to be something that you would spiritually realize is true. So there would be not this, the way Paul's talking to people, you're ignorant, you don't understand, blah, 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 blah. Jesus had basically appealed to people at a different level than scholarly knowledge required. So Paul was definitely somebody who was always in doctrine and, creating ponderous epistles like the book of Romans, which would require sophisticated knowledge of the Bible and everything like that. Jesus made it really simple and direct. Paul made it complicated and very dense and hard to figure out, and also confusing. But I digress. So let's continue with his excellent presentation. I'm going to continue with this very short next section, and instead of taking a break. So let's take a listen. It's entitled Paul's Disdain for the Poor. Page 238. Even his no work, no eat doctrine. Now, I don't know if you know what he said. He actually said, those who will not work shall not eat. He's talking about you cannot give any charity to people who won't work, presumably people who could work but won't work, and he doesn't want to give them any money. Now, we can debate the premise, but the point is that even if they were poor, he wouldn't help them if they were able-bodied and could work. That seems to me kind of a barrier sometimes. People sometimes need money because they're raising a family and they're not making enough money. So the charity isn't just simply whether you can work or not work. It's you got to help somebody when they're down and out and in debt. Maybe lots of people are in debt in this time period, and there was such a thing called debt slavery. There's a whole reason for that, and we call it debt slavery. But they just felt that the way they paid debts off is they had to become an indentured servitude until they could pay off the debt by labor. So Paul's idea that just because someone's able-bodied, you don't give them any food to help them is ignoring the context, and that's a rule you shouldn't just flatly make for all situations. But if somebody is, doing all right, and they're coming to you and say, "Can you give me some food?" Maybe you don't do that. But I even wouldn't make that a rule. Food is food. It's charitable. You just let people share your table. That's just a natural thing. But he's just so over the edge. So anyway, that's what Bouck White is saying. Is that's what he means when he says even his no work, no eat doctrine was directed by him only against the poor. All around him were the rich, virginally innocent of toil, and yet were gorged to the gullet. Yeah, so Paul was hanging out with people who obviously had money, and so why don't you help people who don't have money and need help? Paul sharpens no dagger of invective for these, meaning that people have all the wealth and they're not sharing. He's not encouraging them to help the poor, even though they're able-bodied. They can still be poor. Okay, non-producers, some of whom are in rags and some in tags, but some are also in velvet gowns, should indeed be non-consumers. We hold here no brief for the idle poor. Okay, so I guess what he's saying is I'm not trying to defend the idle poor. Okay, he's talking about the poor in general could be working class poor, and they're still poor, and so that's what he's saying. So next is we're going to go into another topic. So I'm going to break. All right, next topic is Paul's tactical ambiguity. Page 240. The Carpenter had sought sharpness of distinction in economic principles, even though it cut a square across the family circle. Quote, suppose you that am come to give peace on earth. So I guess he's saying, suppose you that I come to give peace on earth, tell you, nay, but rather division. Paul, on the contrary, sought to blur distinctions, his idea being cosmopolitan, mass, mush of humanity, such as exploiters everywhere find favorable to their interests. Page 241. He exhorted with that his hearers should think of, quote, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. He craved that all men should speak well of him. Paul announced himself for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. Quote, which reminds one of Cicero, who, when confronted by some hard choice, would dodge by claiming friendliness to both sides. It is not strange that Paul had to defend himself from the charge of pointlessness. Quote, so fight I, not as one beating the air. Cicero could not have surpassed Paul in the art of trimming his sails to the wind. Quote, unto the Jews I became a Jew as a Jew, to them that are under the law as under the law, to them that are without the law I became as without the law, to the weak I became as weak, and I am made all things to all men. End of quote. Whence perhaps arose the saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. To all of which one can only reply, and it is applicable to the Cicero tribe everywhere. Though you speak with the tongues of men and of angels, if you do not take part against the oppressor, you are become as a sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. So yeah, he's putting Paul in his place basically as a Roman tool. We understand, therefore, why Peter and his fellow Galileans quarreled so bitterly and persistently with Paul. The epistles ascribed to John and Peter in the canon are attributed by scholars today to other authorships. They are too imbued with the Pauline atmosphere of Pharisaic pietism and submissiveness to have been the product of the Galilean mind, which was in utter opposition to Paul and his school. So that's interesting, incidentally, is the very reason that John and Paul's epistles appear to be pro-Paul is a reason to reject them, because that doctrine does not match what we would expect from the Galileans and the people who had written the Gospels in the first place. So that's something to realize. There's a tension between some of the wording in the epistles, supposedly, and I haven't examined that myself carefully, so we'll have to maybe look at that one day. Is John and Peter un un in how can I put it? It's inconsistent that they would talk pro Paul when we have a lot of evidence they were anti Paul, and we actually have the fact they concluded he was a false apostle. That's in Ambrosiaster's work in the mid 300s. entitled A Commentary on the Book of Corinthians. And he in there just matter-of-factly says in passing that the 12 apostles had rejected Paul as a false apostle, but the Corinthians regarded Paul as their apostle because they had seen his signs and wonders. So Ambrose the Astor is not saying this to put Paul down. He's a Paul fan. But he mentions just in passing that the 12 had rejected Paul. And we have other evidence that the 12 called him an apostate, and two findings when we read Irenaeus and Epiphanius about the Ebionite ruling, and the Ebionites was the original name of the earliest church. Okay, let's continue. Page 242. Acts records an attempt to patch up the feud, but the peace there patched together was only makeshift, and the quarrel broke out afresh. In the letters of Paul, the discerning can read between the lines the controversy that is raging. If, quote, if any man preach any other gospel unto you than you have received, let him be anathema, let him be cursed. Paul says, referring to Peter, I withstood him face to face. Paul's literary gifts have preserved his side alone of the quarrel, so that the Peter group seems to have been silenced. In reality, however, they were far from silenced. The feud resumed between their followers, lasted for generations, and colored the history of the early church. So what I also want to say is when we realize the Constantinian purge of history, meaning those scholars, Rufinus in particular, went back and destroyed Greek writings that did not line up with what Constantine wanted. And Constantine wanted Paul to survive most of all because he's the one person who abolished Sabbath 3 times at 3 different passages. And that was crucial to his plan to get us not to rest on Shabbat, not to worship on Shabbat, but to move it to the worship of the day of the sun, which is the next day, which Constantine in 321 AD mandated all people, pagan and Christian, to worship and rest only on the day of the sun. And as we know, when Constantine dies, he's left behind that he is God. On his coin is his what's called his consecration coin. He's now God Constantine. That's never been done by any other emperor, even though they were considered, quote, divine. They never went and said they were actually a god on a coin. When they die, they get to say some things about themselves. None had ever written, I'm a god. God Constantine. And he definitely was saying he was Sol Invictus because he left behind one statue at the Arch of Constantine in Rome, which had him as the face of Sol Invictus on the top of the arch. That's the god of the sun. And then over in Constantinople, his new capital, he had his face right inside the statue of Apollo, which is a Greek name for god of the sun, because now he's in Greek-speaking Constantinople. So now that's Apollo, and he is Apollo, the sun god of the Eastern Empire capital, Constantinople. He's got himself as the face of the god of the sun there. He has his face as the god of the sun sitting in Rome, over on top of the arch of Constantine. So anybody living that day knows this guy thinks he's god of the sun. So yeah, he's definitely purged everything that can be inconsistent with uh he wants to protect Paul from all of the facts that are against Paul. So all of that is to be purged. And maybe what's going on, and if it's true that John and Paul have pro-Paul language, we would then have to presume with this Constantinian purge and Rufinus going back and rewriting things and basically making things appear earlier than they really were. And he doesn't mind rewriting other people to make something that wasn't true in the prior history. He'll just make it up and then create a path that you could think it's true. This guy was unbelievable, and he did this particularly with the works of Origen in the 200 from the 200s, and he's writing in the 380 390 period. So he's an artist, a corruption artist is what he is. Anyway, let's keep going. John was steadfastly with Peter in the antagonism to Paul. In the passage of his book of Revelation, he seems to hurl back at his Romanized Paul the anathemas which Paul was heaping upon him and his fellow Galileans. No name is mentioned, but the characterization points, if not to Paul, then to someone very like him, for the false prophet they are referred to as one who, like Paul, had the power of performing works, psychic wizardry, is someone who made show of lamb-like patience, some who was friendly to the Roman Empire, the beast, and who helped make the proletariat friendly to that empire. He means the lower classes. And it was someone finally who wielded power conferred upon him by the beast. And then it says, John says, I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like lamb, and he spake as a dragon, And he exercised all the power of the first beast and caused the earth of them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, and he deceives them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had the power to do in the sight of the beast. And he had the power to give life unto the image of the beast. Here is wisdom. Let him that has understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of man. John adds that the triumph of this apostate prophet was to be short-lived because the beast was taken with the false prophet. There's suggestion that John was stung to the bitter invective, and John's vituperative vocabulary, once awakened, was of no small compass to Paul's studious neglect of Mary the mother, arousing in him gallantry of rage. For this passage in which John uncorks the vitriol within him follows close on the heels of the soaring tribute to Mary. By the way, it's not John, it's actually Jesus, but he himself is trying to attribute it to John, which is what the scholars do. They try to make it look like Jesus could never have said this, so we're going to just talk as if John's the only one talking, although Jesus is the one who's talking to John. Anyway, I digress. For this passage, when John uncorks the vitriol within him, falls close on the heels of his soaring tribute to Mary. I don't know where he gets that from. Paul studiously ignored Mary, the mother. In fact, his attitude toward woman as a whole was typical of the hard Roman whose ideal was subjugation, meaning of woman, extending even to the wife of his bosom and the mother of his children. Quote, let the woman learn in silence with all subjugation, but suffer not woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but be in silence. For Adam was first formed, and then Eve. There, this is Bouck White is saying, there speaks your true Roman, your true subjugator in every age. That was very Roman attitude, basically, as he's saying. To Aristotle, also slaves were living machines, and women were nature's failure to produce men. So it's like nature didn't go in the right course. So Aristotle says every birth of a woman is a mistake. You want to always have men because men build bridges and whatever, as if women's taking care of children and raising children isn't as important as anything else. All right. Anyway, there is in Paul an absence of the finer sentiments unthinkable that he should have gone to war for Helen, quote, the face that launched a thousand ships. Despite his rhetorical sky shooting and mystic exaltations, there is in Paul hard and mechanical note. Unlike the carpenter, he does not consider the lilies, neither does he see in little children any benediction. His, quote, the man is not the woman, but the woman is of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man, reeks of Rome's hard masterfulness. If John's words against Paul or against someone very like him seem overheated, he's talking about Revelation again, let the reader recall the circumstances under which they were uttered. Paul was citizen and boastful one of Rome's blood-stained empire, which at that moment under Nero was the most blood-stained of any time in its history. Rome's persecution lighted on the other Christians, but they lighted not on Paul. That's important. I don't know if he knows that, but Paul did not die at Rome. And we told you, First Clement, the earliest writing of Christianity, said he died. He went to Spain and left this world, meaning he died in Spain. And he didn't say he was martyred there. He just died. It makes it sound like he died a natural death, and that people can die a natural death. But later, 300 years later, the story of martyrdom for the first time emerges, that Paul was killed at Rome, which there was no story earlier, and is inconsistent, most importantly, with First Clement. And this was considered the earliest, it was earlier part of canon, was always spoken as if it was canon. But later, for some reason, it just is not mentioned in the 300s, and it's gone. And it's basically probably the Constantinian purge going on. This is not consistent with what they want. Paul has to be elevated to a martyr. And why? Because he's the one guy who gets rid of Shabbat and switches it to the day of the sun, which is exactly what Constantine's one of his primary aims was to get us to change Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday to the God of the sun that he set for the next day. But I digress. Anyway, now, so Nero, it was a bloodstained time, blah, blah, blah. The Galilean party saw their friends and kindred dragged into the Roman Colosseum, nailed to crosses there, and torn from the spikes by the ravening beast, or dressed in tunics soaked with pitch, saw them burned to death, wrapped in shirts of fire. And Paul himself, exempt from that persecution, was boasting of the citizenship in the empire that was persecuting these others. Now, that's another thing. it's impossible to believe that a Roman citizen would ever have been martyred at all in Rome. One thing Rome is good about, we don't care. You could do everything you want, but if you're a Roman citizen, you're untouchable. So the whole idea that he ever could have been martyred is inconsistent with the very fact that when he was arrested at Rome, the reason he was protected from any abuse was because he said, "I'm a Roman citizen." And if you remember, they were about to whip him or abuse him, and he was able to stop it by saying, "I'm a Roman citizen," because you're never allowed to whip or physically abuse a prisoner who was a Roman citizen. They had this exemption from that. So, so the whole idea he ever could have been martyred, uh, the death penalty for what? For being participating in a religious group? That would never happen. So the whole idea is a complete myth. The Judaism, Jewish Christians, yes, they'll kill them every day and Sunday because they're not Roman citizens for participating in an illegal religion. There was not a capital crime to engage in an illegal religion, just so you know. Anyway, so there's a little bit of definite exaggeration about Paul's dying as a martyr. The more I think about it, not just from First Clement saying he went to Spain and then went out of this world. It's just more than that. You have this evidence that he's a Roman citizen, and the crime of engaging in an illicit religion is not death. Anyway, even when, like Cicero, he met his own death at last, where Rome had used him to her satisfaction, he still had wherewith to boast. For to him was meted out soldierly death, beheading. Roman citizen could not be crucified or burned to death. Okay, yeah, that's what he's saying. So that I should make that clear. Yes, a Judean Christian could be put to death, but a Roman citizen never could be put to death for any crime like engaging in an illicit religion. Maybe I didn't make that clear. And that's what he's saying. Clearly, that didn't happen. All right. Now we're getting towards the end now, and I'm trying to wrap it up if I can within a shorter period of time, in less than 38 minutes. We'll see if I can do that. Okay, well, you know what? It turns out we're at approximately, let me see here, we're at 41 minutes, 52 seconds. So I'm going to stop here. I want to show you what the headings are coming up, and I'll put them in a part 2. Christianity is betrayed from within is the next section. How Paul's writings were added to the New Testament. Jesus' message was one of equal rights and no dominion over each other. And modern brand of Christianity has become immoral, and the uniqueness of Jesus. Judaism is rising back up to embrace original Christianity. And I think the status quo thinking is what crucified Christ, and that's it. So we got a lot more to go. I didn't realize this is a lot to chew off, so we've got to stop it here to keep this at a reasonable length for everybody. And then look for part 2. And God bless. Take care. Good night. Ciao. Bye.